Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit, I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. This will be our second episode. I'm delighted to share that listeners from Zurich, Switzerland, France, Lahui, Hawaii, other cities in Hawaii too, as far away as Braintree, Massachusetts, and 16 other states, plus let's include Argentina and Uruguay, all tuned in. Thanks very much for that. In each episode, my colleague Rob Good and I interview a historian about their scholarship, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan, sometimes more than one, that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. Rob, what is our topic for today?
Well, we're just going to take on a small little topic, the American Civil War. It's one of the most challenging units for teachers to design because there are just so many important events that occur, and most survey courses don't give very much time, or teachers don't have very much time to address this critical episode in American history. So,
well, then it begs the question, who is our guest today?
It's the big reveal. Today we have with us, we are thrilled to have Ed Ayers with us today. Ed is the Tucker-Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and and President Emeritus at the University of Richmond. He's also one of our nation's leading scholars on the Civil War. In addition to writing numerous books, award-winning books, one with National Book Award finalist and Pulitzer Prize finalist, he has also co-edited the Valley of the Shadow digital project, which is a remarkable project through the New American History, where you can gain access to documents from two counties, in one northern and one southern, during the Civil War. It's a completely free resource that's available. Some of our listeners may also know Ed through the Backstory podcast, which was a great resource for history teachers and for history enthusiasts alike.
Incredible. I want to hear. Thanks, Ed, for doing this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I look forward to figuring out the Civil War.
All right, here we go. Ed, here's our big question. What do you believe are the most important concepts about the Civil War that teachers should share with their students?
I believe the most important one is to acknowledge what it is that kids think walking into the classroom. And, polls not too long ago showed that about 40% of Americans across all different kinds of demographics, including young people, believe that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, not over slavery. And what's remarkable is that there's no historian who has said that for like 40 years. And so how is it that people can hold on to that belief that the Civil War was, as they say, really about economics or cultural differences or states' rights, when that's not the case and not what historians have said? So I think acknowledging that that might be what a lot of kids would think is a good place to begin. And the other thing that's surprising, that this is not regionally determined. This is not just evasion by white Southern kids. A lot of kids from the North and people of different ethnicities also find reason to believe that, I just find it hard to imagine that the United States went to war to end slavery. I look around today and I see plenty of evidence that there are lots of people in the United States who resist Black freedom. Why would I think it would have been any different then? So it's ironic that we might identify that belief with a conservative point of view, but in some ways, people on the far left can be skeptical of it as well, to believe that there's, and you know the stories, Abraham Lincoln didn't really believe this, and we know all the reservations that people have. So the goal is to show what role did slavery play in the coming of the Civil War, without just stomping our foot and say it was too central. And so I think that in some ways we have to acknowledge the complexity both of the event, but also of our students' current beliefs if we're going to make any progress on it. Does that make sense to you guys?
Totally. I mean, my experience teaching high school history, even advanced placement U.S. history, students would come in and say, well, wasn't it? It was about states' rights. And, trying to say, well, let's take a look at what the record said. Let's look at Alexander Stevens' Cornerstone speech or something along those lines to try and open up that conversation. And I know, Eric, you have a lot of experience working with teachers all across the nation. Do you find that as well?
I do. Of course, not so much with teachers. I think teachers have an idea that, slavery is paramount to the coming of the Civil War. But I guess the big question is, how do we introduce that to our students?
And that's exactly right. We have a great evasion that we've used for the last century that drives me crazy, which is that the North was an industrial society and the South was agrarian, and therefore they went into a war that killed 750,000 of Americans. And they got stuck in the 1920s, and it seems to be kind of a blameless explanation that lets everybody off the hook. And it has so many problems. I think it's something else that maybe to introduce. If they don't believe it's states' rights, they believe it's industrial versus agrarian, therefore economic, right? The problem is there was no economic reason in the world for the somewhat industrial society of the North, in which the great majority of people are also farmers, would go to a war to end its supply of the most valuable single commodity in the world, on which the industry that it did have, textile manufacturing, depended. And so we got stuck in that idea, partly because we think that the Civil War was a war between the past and the future. The South was agrarian, old-fashioned, therefore it sort of had to be displaced by us, by progress and modernity in the industrial. The fact is that the South was agrarian, but it was basically agribusiness based on forced labor. It's not people, out whittling on the front porch, independent of the most valuable resource in America was the enslaved population of the United States. And so there's something else we need to displace. So to answer your question eventually, Eric, the point is okay, if it's not industrial versus agrarian and it's not states' rights, and we know that Abraham Lincoln did not say that he was going to war to end slavery, how was it about slavery? So I think it's actually what I would do is begin with a student's well-placed skepticism and say, okay, yeah, I can see why you would doubt that, because it was never proclaimed by the majority of white Northerners that they were going to fight against slavery. You read the letters of the soldiers, they say they are fighting to preserve the United States, not to end slavery. So it's not a simple thing that we just need to say, kids these days, why don't they get it? I think leaning into the complexity is what you actually need to do. So that's how I would get it. I would say, kids, here's a problem we need to solve together. All these historians keep saying it's slavery, but boy, here's the thing. And the fact that I always point out is that Abraham Lincoln, won 39% of the vote. And if the Democrats hadn't divided in 1860, he wouldn't have won. And then the fundamental fact, and I guess to answer your question, what people need to know, in 1864, after all the victories and the great eloquence of Gettysburg and everything, nearly half of white Northern men still would not vote for Abraham Lincoln. 45% of white Northern men still voted for the Democrats in 1864. And if Atlanta hadn't fallen and the Shenandoah Valley hadn't fallen, Abraham Lincoln would not have been reelected. So there's really only one turning point in the Civil War. It's the reelection of Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Because if he doesn't win, the war ends with a different outcome than it would have had. So with all of that, you sort of kind of throw the story off balance. And I think that's another important thing to do, because we've domesticated this story so much. We turned it the mental thing with fiddle music in the background, and that it was somehow everybody was great, even though many people had to be drafted, many people deserted, enormous numbers of people died needlessly. Americans killed more of each other than any war. We sort of forget how terrible this event was. We've cleaned it up so much. I sometimes say it's like the gray team versus the blue team, and we talk about that. So I guess I would boldly say that you need to understand the battles, but not like the beads on the string that they're often taught, but rather how do they fit into the larger story. So you may say, well, Ed, what is that larger story? You've told us what not to do. What would you do? Are you interested in what my suggestion is, Jim?
Absolutely,
We are.
absolutely. And when you talk about student skepticism, I mean, they were always very skeptical of anything I was doing. So using that skepticism into to get them exploring the complexity of the Civil War is great. So yeah, what strategy? How would you get into that story? And also, well, we can come back and talk about this in a little bit, but thinking about how teachers, particularly right now, are concerned about taking on challenging or controversial or what might be seen as divisive historical narratives.
As well, they should be. And, this should be one of the most contentious subjects in American history, right? If we haven't sort of dulled all the blades by all our invasions and so forth. So here's what I would say. Kids, you actually know how to explain complex historical phenomena. Since you were a child, you have practiced in techniques that allow you to understand how things end up in one way that started another way. You know that people are not all good or all bad, but can change. How do you know these things? Through stories. A story is sort of a natural way of explaining. We've taken the story out of the Civil War and turned it into just a single thing that has a cause. You have to choose which cause was it. Well, it's caused over and over again. So what I would do is I would say, okay, you understand stories. You understand how things don't turn out the way people expect. The Civil War is 3 stories braided together. Okay? And you have to understand each one on its own before you can see how they fit together. The first story is that of the would-be Confederacy. Because if they don't threaten to secede, there's no Civil War. Okay? Why? They say we want to create our own nation where the future of slavery cannot be infringed upon or threatened. That's what they explicitly say. And it's our right. It's our state right. And that's an important thing to do when you're teaching. Say, I can see why you say states' rights. That's the language they used, the Confederacy used, to explain why they deserved to leave a United States that they'd helped create. It was their right to step out of a compact that they had helped create. And you don't have to look too far to think about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and other Southerners who did help create the nation, right? So that's their point of view. Now, do they believe that there is going to be, that the United States is going to be willing to fight to keep them in the United States? They don't. Do they think the United States could occupy an area the size of continental Europe and keep them in the United States? No, they do not. Do they believe it's possible that there's going to be a 4-year war that's going to kill 250,000 of their military-age men? They do not. And do they imagine that the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the modern world can be brought to an end, of 4 million people, can be brought to an end virtually overnight and with no compensation for the former owners? They do not. So in this case, the Civil War from the viewpoint of the Confederacy is like a Greek tragedy. They have these characteristics, devotion to slavery. They're very arrogant about it. They say, we control the world economy. And then they lose everything that they had fought for. Okay? So that's one plot line. The second plot line is that of the United States. And I do think it's important that we don't just talk about the North and the South. We talk about the United States and the would-be Confederacy, which is what Lincoln always called it, the would-be or the so-called Confederacy, right? And they are not equal. The United States is fighting for its very life, that if it begins to break apart, that there's no telling where it might stop. So what they have to do is to persuade the white Northern electorate to keep fighting, even though it becomes clear they're not going to be able to win unless they destroy slavery. If you had an election and say, how many of you white Northerners would vote to fight a war, send your sons to end slavery? Well, we already know. What percentage of Northerners were abolitionists? 2%, okay? And so they just thought it would have been impossible. And this is something that everybody would have believed impossible. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Stephens, that the system of slavery could be brought to an end. But what could happen is that the United States could be kept from being destroyed by what they saw as traitors and rebels. So everything they do is driven by their determination to keep the United States alive. And we know that's what Abraham Lincoln says, right? So that's the second story, the United States. What's the third story? It's the most straightforward and most powerful of all. From the first moments of secession, enslaved people did everything they could to escape and then destroy slavery. Within 3 weeks of Virginia's secession at Fort Monroe, after more than 200 years of slavery, men go to Fort Monroe and say, we're on your side. We're on the side of the United States. And then 200,000 African-American men fight for the United States, more than all the soldiers at Gettysburg. And women as well as men and young and old, sometimes far from the battlefront, did everything they could to help the United States preserve itself. They freed themselves over and over again. So if you have these three stories and they're all dramatic, right? They're not just one big blob of, and then there was Antietam, and then there was Gettysburg, and then there was, Vicksburg, whatever, in which case you forget all the human drama for it. If you want to say, what was at stake at Gettysburg? Well, that's the only time the Confederacy actually penetrated into Northern territory. What did they do when they did? They captured free Black people and took them back into slavery, right? So if you tell all these as stories and remind kids, look, you grew up on Harry Potter, you know complexities of stories and how these things, you see how these things twine together. The Civil War is a whole different thing than just this big object that you have to explain. So what do you think? You guys buy that?
I think you brought us and our students out of the opium den and livened us up a little bit. So that's great. I really like the way you boiled the progression or the topics into 3 subtopics. That's really valuable. Rob?
Well, yeah. And, getting into those stories, oftentimes the progression of battles and things like that, are there any particular documents or episodes that you think capture, particularly, let's take that last story as an example. What would you point to for teachers maybe to grab onto that story and help the students explore that complexity?
No, Rob, you were kind enough to mention the Valley of the Shadow Project, which is at newamericanhistory.org, which is the thing for which I'm executive director now. And Annie Evans, who's a really skilled teacher, is there every day collaborating with people all over the United States. Kids can read the letters of of a Black family that had 5 brothers fighting for the United States, and they're writing letters home from the very beginning, and they can see how. But you also have accounts of a woman who's being sold in Charlottesville to her husband, saying, "I don't know what's going to happen to me and our son." One letter, in some ways, can highlight this in a way that massive amounts of others. And so the Valley of the Shadow, they could go through and look at how the Northern and Southern newspapers are portraying every event along the way. So you'd say, here, look for yourself. What were they actually saying? What did they identify? And you'll see idealism, and you'll see racism, and you'll see determination. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing I would do also in New American History, we work with the Digital Scholarship Lab at University of Richmond, make these incredible maps. So we have maps of voting for Congress and voting for the president. Every election, they can actually watch how every different part of the country is shifting. So if you're teaching somewhere in Ohio or somewhere in Texas, you can actually not in Texas, because you have to still be in the United States for this data to exist in 1864. But you can see in 1860 who voted for the strong secessionist candidate, right? So what you can do then is actually imagine, okay, you are in this moment. What would you do? How would you vote? Why would they vote this way? So that's what I would do, is I would present a problem, and then here we're giving you these tools. You explore, you come up with your own explanation for why that is.
And it's a powerful, I've found that students they've seen the Gettysburg Address, they've seen, and those are important documents to share. But when it's real people and it's so accessible, it's a beautiful, the new housing of it is just beautiful. It's a great way to capture those stories. So thank you for that tip. And listeners, please know that we will have a link to the Valley of the Shadow in the episode notes. Check it out. And we'll probably try and do some support around that as well. And Annie Evans is remarkable as well. So,
right.
Yeah. Wow. So within 15 minutes, you just totally shifted how everything I did in 27 years of teaching, because I tended to focus on Lincoln and the big political ideals, and I didn't get into the stories of individuals really until Reconstruction. So
let me just pause there for a minute. One benefit of this approach is it does not diminish Abraham Lincoln. Matter of fact, it shows that the fact that 45% of white Northern men still voted against him does not diminish him. It suggests that only he could have kept the United States together long enough to accomplish this great thing. So that's one of the advantages of stories. People don't have to be all good or all bad. You don't have to decide, was Abraham Lincoln racist or, an angel? No, you can say you can watch him develop and struggle, but you can also watch the population of both places struggle just in the same way that Lincoln did. So, the point of all this is to democratize the story by including everybody in it. When you do that, you see everybody had choices to make. Everybody, and there were a lot of mistakes and a lot of tragedies, but also a lot of triumph and idealism. So I don't mean for this approach to do anything other than to make history even more human than it is.
It's a great place to end, making it
Sounds
human.
like you, thanks a lot for taking Rob out of retirement. He wants to go back in the classroom now and right his wrong in teaching the Civil War. I know it happened. Is that true, Rob, or no?
No, I don't want to come out of retirement.
Good.
Okay.
Another false statement.
Yeah,
Great.
there we go. Yeah.
Here we go.
Again with this.
Anyway, Ed, thank you very much for your time and expertise in the Civil War. Remember, listeners, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. We'll have other links there for you too. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
All right. See you all on the next episode.
You won't see anybody on the next episode. Stop the recording.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Wow. Ed Ayers is a genius. In just 20 minutes, he was able to frame the Civil War around 3 different storylines that expose the complexity of the time period. His discussion inspired me to develop a lesson to introduce those stories with short primary sources. In the lesson, students read selections from Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, and Garrison Frazier, a Black minister in Savannah, Georgia. All 3 stories demonstrate the centrality of slavery in the conflict, and students will be able to see how those stories interact with each other over time, or, as Ed so beautifully put it, how they are braided together. What about you, Eric?
Wow, that is a not too shabby lesson. Not too shabby at all, I would say, Rob. My lesson revolves around 2 newspapers. First, the New York Times from 1861. The other newspaper is the Staunton Vindicator in 1864 with a letter to the editor. In the Times article, it's noted that there are 1,800 Confederate slaves who found refuge in Fort Monroe in Virginia. Now, in the second document, the letter to the editor in the Staunton Vindicator in 1864, an unknown person is complaining about General Butler's order to have meals, wait for it, meals that are integrated. Oh, the horror. There is some highly offensive racial language in this article. So the original and an edited version are provided for your convenience. The letter comes from the Valley of the Shadow website that Ed Ayers referred to. Now, have students take a look at the changes from 1861 to 1864 in these articles, as well as the continuities of racism, as there is a strong element of segregation that exists toward the end of the Civil War, even in the Union.
Dude, why are you always one-upping me? God, that's an amazing lesson. Well, thank you all for listening. And remember, you can download both of these lessons from the link provided in the episode notes associated with this episode. Please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram. And please, if you're so inclined, give us a favorable review wherever you get your podcasts.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. Now, history in 20 is all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us today.